Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, Working with Victims. I'm Travis Johnson, your moderator for today's session. I'm a Grants Program Associate with the American Probation and Parole Association, and we're happy to provide you today's webinar through BJA grant funding. We are joined by Ann Seymour, co-founder and senior advisor of Justice Solution. A recorded version of this webinar will also be made available if you have to leave early. The session should be posted next week on YouTube, and a link will be provided by APPA on the Tribal Repository website. We'd love to hear from you. Feel free to post your questions throughout the session, and we will designate the last 15 minutes or so to respond to your questions. For those of you joining us, welcome. I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Ann Seymour is co-founder and senior advisor of the Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit Justice Solution, specializing in criminal and juvenile justice, crime victims' rights and services, and community safety. Current work includes public policy development, training and technical assistance, program evaluation, strategic planning, and research in victim assistance, corrections-based victim services, family violence, the news media's coverage of crime, juvenile justice, and restorative justice. She has over 20 years of experience, first as the Director of Public Affairs for the National Office of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and from 1985 to 1993 as the co-founder and Director of Communications of the National Victim Center, now known as National Center for Victims of Crime. She has been a national and international advocate for crimes victims' rights. She has developed and implemented training and technical assistance programs to strengthen victims' rights and services in law enforcement, prosecution, judiciary, juvenile justice, and community institutional corrections. We will now begin our session. It is a great honor to introduce our presenter, Ann Seymour.
Well, thank you, Travis, and good afternoon to everyone who's joined the webinar. I want to also add that I've worked closely with APPA over the past 20 years, specifically on training related to working with victims in tribal communities, which has just been among my most favorite work. And I also want to give a really big thanks to the Bureau of Justice Assistance for its support not only of this webinar, but they have been fabulous over my 35-year career in supporting crime victims. So thanks to BJA and thanks to all of you for joining today. What I want to do today is talk a little bit about trauma and how it affects victims and how it then affects our capacity to communicate and work with victims. I want to talk a little bit about things that we can say to victims that are helpful and things that we probably shouldn't say to victims that are not helpful. And overall, just talk about effective strategies to talk to victims of crime. And as Travis said, we're going to leave time at the end of our session today for questions and discussion. I always start when talking about working with victims with my favorite quote from my very good friend Cheryl Ward Kaiser. Cheryl's daughter was sexually assaulted in front of her, and her husband was murdered in front of her as a result of a home invasion by 4 teenage kids in California. Cheryl's gone on to do amazing work working to do victim impact classes for youthful offenders in California. And Cheryl said victims remember 2 things: those who help and those who hurt. And I always encourage people to remember that because, if we don't really understand enough about victim trauma and what victims go through, we can end up saying and doing things that are hurtful. And at the same time, especially in probation, we just have an amazing opportunity to be able to help crime victims. I just want to start also by talking about why we really need to care about victim trauma and the importance of understanding it. And I'm quoting research over the years from the Medical University of South Carolina, the National Crime Victim Research and Treatment Center. That's a mouthful. But MUSC tells us that trauma is really one of the biggest reasons why victims don't want to participate in justice processes and community corrections. It's just too overwhelming for them. And we know from a lot of research that when we address victims' trauma and really try to think about what their needs are, it will increase their capacity and their willingness to cooperate. And very important to me is the third point. It increases victims' perceptions of community correction specifically and the justice process overall. And I know a lot of you have dealt with victims who do not have good perceptions of the work that we do, so that's really important. And the last couple things are also, I think, critical. it can decrease the potential that victims have for secondary trauma. And when I say secondary trauma, that's just the things that happen going through the justice system, talking to people who aren't sensitive to their needs, that just exacerbates the original trauma of being a crime victim, and very often makes that original trauma much, much worse. And the last one, when I think about community corrections, is also really important. If we help victims deal with their trauma, it will increase the effectiveness of victim input. And when I think in terms of community corrections, I mean, this means victims telling us what they know about the case, giving us really good information for your pre-sentence investigation reports or for victim impact statements that can help you better with effective case management and supervising the probationer in the community. So victim input, again, to me is, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, is essential. So that's why y'all should care. The things that you need to be aware of that sort of are difficult for crime victims is sometimes just seeing the offender in court or at any probation release hearing. Just, for a lot of victims will bring back a flood of bad memories of the crime. And we ask victims to talk to us about and think a lot about the crime, for many of them, the worst thing that's ever happened to them, so that they can be good witnesses, so that they can be helpful in the criminal justice system proceedings. And just thinking about it can be very, very painful for victims. The third point here is something where you all have a really significant role, and that is just in how we work with victims and talk to victims. The most important thing we can do is to let them know that we believe them and we don't blame them for what happened. And why this is important is because a lot of people second guess the victim, and trust me, many victims themselves blame themselves for what happened. And so we have to do everything we can to mitigate those circumstances. I think one of the biggest barriers that victims have is not understanding the system and not understanding specifically community corrections. And I've done probably most of my work in my career has been with victims in the correction system. And I will tell you, when you hear corrections or you hear probation, victims immediately think that you're on the team of the probationer. They don't see you as someone who can be helpful to them. And so that's a big part of helping them understand the process. Is also your role in the process. Regardless of the type of victimization, and I know you all have a lot of personal experience with this, the victim's individual safety and security is probably the most important thing that we have to be able to assess and address. And victims don't always express their safety concerns. So it has to be a big part of what we do in our communications with them. And then, as I said earlier, just making sure they understand that that you're there to help them, and that hopefully as we go through today and in your own experience, that you work with victim advocates, that we're all sort of on the same team for justice and to make sure that the victim's needs are adequately addressed. What affects victim trauma? I ask people to think about their own lives, and most of us have a few, and some of us have overwhelming stressors in our lives. And so the crime is, for many victims, just another horrible stressor in a life that might already be stressful. And when you think about victims who, have limited English proficiency, who may have mental or behavioral health challenges, those kind of stressors can be very, very significant and really affect their level of trauma. My experience working in tribal jurisdictions is that there are a lot of victims who have past traumatic experiences. It may be childhood abuse, it may be witnessing domestic violence, it may be substance use disorders, either their own or others. And so it becomes really important to recognize how those might affect the trauma of the victimization. A real big thing is how victims are treated by other people. And this includes their family members, their friends, their multi-faith communities, and of course, justice professionals. And I find often as a victim advocate that I just spend a lot of time apologizing for really offensive things that well-meaning people might say to victims, and you will be in that position as well, where they just don't understand why people say the things they do, and we're going to talk about some of those things in today's discussion. And the last one is probably the most important: whether or not the victim has access to mental health and to supportive services. And a big part in community corrections that I'll talk a bit more about is letting victims know that victim compensation programs in every single state, if a victim reports and cooperates, victim compensation will pay for services in mental health support and counseling for survivors, which is a really big part of helping them get back on their feet. I want to talk about what happens when, just for a minute, when a victim, when someone is victimized, the immediate reactions that victims talk about going through, again, based on decades of research in my field. Victims talk about a sense of terror and a sense of shock about what is happening. And a lot of victims, the shock is, really that it's happening to me personally. This leads for victims to be extremely anxious and kind of not knowing what's going to happen as the crime is occurring, but also afterwards when they're reporting the crime and they're talking to law enforcement officials and they're participating in the front end of the system, which y'all don't have a whole lot of control over, but we're asking victims to give us information when they are in a total state of disarray and high anxiety. And so sometimes that can lead to confusion on the things that they're saying. It lead to some real challenges in the actual case that's going on. And when I talk about short-term reactions, I really don't like to put time factors on victims, but this tends to be in the weeks and the months after the crime has occurred, the victim is reporting, and this may be when you come into the victim's orbit. So this is pretty important. You notice that the high anxiety very often does not go away, because if a victim is not getting supportive services, if they're not being validated, that's going to be a problem for them. Victims sometimes may look distressed, and sometimes they may be very distressed but appear perfectly calm. I've always learned as a victim advocate to simply ask victims, is there anything that is causing you distress in your life today? And that, for a lot of victims, it's like they're so grateful that I asked that, because they don't know always how to put words to the feelings that they're having. It's really important to recognize that they may have real problems with concentrating. And I want you all to think about what the criminal justice system and what community corrections in particular require of victims and witnesses, and that is that they be sharp and that they be able to concentrate, and that they can be pretty linear in their thinking and talking. And for a lot of victims, this can be really challenging. The concerns that victims have about safety just don't go away unless we can really identify those concerns and get them to a victim advocate who can help them with things like safety planning. And a lot of victims, one of the physiological outcomes of trauma is simply sleep disturbances. They'll sleep too much, they won't be able to sleep at all, they'll sleep in the middle of the day, and that again is just one of the common reactions that victims will have. And the last two are ones that I've talked a little bit about, but it's something that we have to express kind of our gratitude to victims for talking to us, because they are telling us about the worst thing that has happened in their life. And also just letting them know that we believe what they are telling us, and that what happened is not their fault. I spend a good bit of most conversation with victims validating those things that I just mentioned. The other thing is important to remember that there's usually a bit of time between when the crime occurs and when you start to interact with the victims. And this may affect your communications. And I'll give you just an example or two. If a victim doesn't have a good experience with law enforcement who responds to them, and I've heard from a lot of victims in Indian nations that they, especially victims of intimate partner violence, they didn't have a good experience, and they felt that they were being blamed and shamed for what happened. That's going to carry on to how they view the criminal justice system and how they view their interactions with you. And the other thing that I think is really important and a little bit confusing for victims, in addition to the amount of time, is also that a lot of your cases are going to cross jurisdictions. And by that I mean sometimes tribal, sometimes federal, sometimes state and local. I've worked with survivors who have literally had cases that crossed into all the jurisdictions. And so this can be really, really confusing, and you'll spend a lot of time just explaining the different jurisdictions to victims and why they end up in the one that you're involved in. So there's a lot you can't control that happens before you interact with victims. But what you can tell victims is that, that you're the one that's trying to assist them now, and you're going to do the best job that you possibly can. And I feel that that's just a really important thing to help build trust with the survivor. I want to talk also about some of the longer term responses, and these tend to arise, very often around the time that you will be working with victims. I don't want to go into this entire list because it is very sad and very challenging, but just know that victims who have very significant trauma reactions and who don't talk to anybody and who don't get help end up with just a whole lot of problems. And they literally have a changing view of the world. Before they were a victim, they probably thought of it as a safe place, and they don't any longer. They often have trust issues, and my experience is that survivors sometimes, it takes a while to build trust with me as a victim advocate, and certainly with justice professionals like you. And they become very focused on seeking justice. And, with survivors, for me, and working in community corrections, it's really important to help the victim identify, what does justice mean to you? And for a lot of folks, they want to feel safe. They want the perpetrator to be held accountable, and they don't want him to do it to anyone else. And increasingly, and I see this a lot in tribal jurisdictions, they want the person who harmed them to get help. And whether the help comes from really good community supervision or alcohol or other drug treatment, mental behavioral health counseling, that type of thing. Having victims identify what justice means is going to be a really important thing in your work. And I don't want to go into a tutorial on post-traumatic stress disorder, but just recognize that for a lot of victims, the long-term mental health impact, if not addressed, can result in PTSD, which makes it very, very difficult for them to be effective witnesses, to participate in justice processes, and can often lead to some behaviors that cause even further challenges to their mental health. I want to talk for a second about things that might affect your communications with victims. And like I said, I've spent over 30 years working specifically in probation, so this really comes from my heart, but also from my personal experience. And the first thing is really how much information you have about the victim and you have about the case. And why this is important is that, sometimes you don't have a whole lot to go on. And you have to really, I always recommend that people build relationships with victim advocates, both within the system, but also in the community, like at rape crisis centers and domestic violence shelters, so that you can find out about the victim. Because very often I know you'll get a case file that will have, basically a witness name, and if you're lucky, a phone number, and not a whole lot else. And so that becomes a real challenge, to be able to know as much as possible about who you're talking to and what happened in the case before you actually, get in touch with victims, whether it's over the phone or in person. I talked a little bit about victim trauma, but it's important to recognize that sometimes their trauma is going to affect their reactions to you and their capacity or ability to build a relationship of trust, and that's really important to recognize. I think I always advise people to explain to victims what what is community corrections? What is this thing that we call probation? And why are they talking to a probation officer? Very often we make assumptions that victims understand all that, and they don't. And a simple explanation, or I encourage people to have a victim landing page on their websites where victims can sort of get a bird's eye view of what probation is all about. And the last thing to me is the most important, and that is your level of comfort. And for me, it's critical for me to validate that, when people signed up to be probation officers, back when I started in this work, working with victims wasn't part of the job description. And working with victims who are traumatized and working with victims that you've maybe seen 3 or 4 times before, especially in cases of intimate partner violence, it can be really, really challenging. And so your level of comfort with yourself and your ability to have a good conversation with victims and your ability to know resources that you can refer victims to, that becomes a big and a very important part of your work. And I just want to add, I'm going to talk about this, but we have thousands of victim assistance programs that I always tell probation, we got your back. We're there to be able to provide support to the victims and witnesses whom you serve. So when you're talking with victims, sometimes interviews can just be really, really challenging. They might be angry. Trauma, as I mentioned, will cause them to sometimes have a lot of confusion, and sometimes they just don't want to talk to you. And I find often that is because they don't understand your role. They think you're on team probationer, and so they're just not really interested in having a conversation with you. And as I said earlier, when we talk to victims, we're asking them to relive a really awful time in their lives. So recognizing that, I think, is pretty important. Very often there's limited information, and a lot of it is on what you can tell the victim. I worked with West Virginia Community Corrections, and I'm happy to share it with everyone. We came up with a list of things that you can and cannot tell the victim, because people in probation there were really thinking we can't tell the victim anything. And if you look at state law and your agency policy, there's a lot you can tell the victim about the case, about case management and what you're plan to do in terms of case supervision with the probationer. And the other thing is that sometimes there's limited information on what the victim can tell you, and sometimes it's because they don't know, sometimes it's because they don't remember. And so the limits on information are one of the biggest challenges that you're going to face. And the last one, I think you've probably all heard the term vicarious trauma, but that is simply when you work with folks who are traumatized, very often the trauma just rubs off on you. And so recognize that talking to victims can be very stressful. And I always tell folks to, take their time and get as much information as possible and take a deep breath before you pick up that phone and talk to a victim, because you need to be in a really good frame of mind so that the trauma doesn't seep over into your own life and into your work experience. Just good communication skills, and you probably know these. With victims, sometimes we talk too much or too fast. We have a lot of information that we want to impart to survivors, and they are just not able always to process it as fast as we are able to deliver it. On the other hand, sometimes when people are intimidated by talking to victims, we don't say enough and we don't offer enough detail. And probably the one that for victims is the most challenging is that we seem to talk a different language in community corrections, and certainly in the victim assistance field. We use a lot of jargon, and I want you to think about in your own universe, what are some examples of community corrections jargon that victims and survivors might not understand? And I hope you're kind of going over that in your head right now. And I will tell you, victims don't understand probation. They don't understand how it's different from parole. When we talk about victim compensation and victim restitution, very often they will think it's the same thing, so we have to do a little bit of explaining about that. And then a lot of the terms that we use in terms of community supervision, um, for victims, it's not just throwing those words out, but asking victims afterwards if they understand what has been said, and if there's any clarification that's needed, being able to tell them that. Um, It's really easy to encourage communication, and I know a lot of your work is over the phone, but if you're in person, our body language is really, really important. Being able to lean forward a little bit, not crossing our arms, using eye contact when it's appropriate, and recognizing that for all survivors, it is not universally appropriate. For me, and hopefully you can tell, tone of voice becomes really, really important. We want to have a voice that's calm and as reassuring as we possibly can be to victims. The most important thing, the best tip of probably this entire webinar, is to really explain to victims why you are talking to them, why they're being a witness in the case is important. If you're completing a pre-sentence investigation report, not saying I'm doing a PSI report, need to talk to you, explaining what that report is, and the fact that their input is really important to be able to come up with a plan and to come up with effective supervision strategies that hold the offender accountable, and that hopefully reduce that person's chance of recidivism. That becomes, again, really important to victims. Setting guidelines for the interview, means being able to talk to the victim when it's a really good time for them to talk. If you have time limitations, which I'll talk about a little bit later, being very clear that you only have a certain amount of time, and asking the victims if they have any questions about the interview that you're going to have even before you start it, so that they can sort of guide you to be able to meet their needs. I find in Indian country the sensitivity to cultural issues is extremely, extremely important. And I always tell folks who work in tribal probation to just ask their local victim advocates to give them a 2 or 3 hour overview of some of the cultural issues that are specific to victims in Indian country, but in particular also to victims of intimate partner violence, be it sexual assault or child abuse or domestic violence and human trafficking, because I have learned so much from my work with tribal women about really being able to be a much more effective communicator. The other thing is sometimes you're going to have victims who have physical or intellectual or mental disabilities that you have to just be aware of what those are and how they might affect your ability to communicate with them. And the other thing is that it's important that you recognize and address confidentiality issues. For victims in tribal probation, this means that they need to know, if they're talking to you for a PSI report, will that information be available to the alleged or convicted perpetrator? They need to know, as I said earlier, are there boundaries on what you can share with them about what is happening with the probationer? And so being aware of confidentiality provisions, either by state law or tribal law or agency policy, becomes really, really important in terms of your communications with victims. The other thing, and I'm going to spend a minute on this, is that we need to be aware about victims' rights. And on this slide, these are sort of the core rights that victims in every jurisdiction, whether it's tribal, state, or federal, have. Treating them with fairness, dignity, and respect, it should go without saying, but it's always kind of the first of our list. And the things that we can do in probation that are super important is to make sure that victims have information about what's happening in our universe of probation, and they're notified about case hearings that are coming up. They're notified about outcomes of what happens with the hearings. And participation for a lot of victims is really important. For others, they do not want to participate and they don't want to show up, but they do have the right to do so. And I find out that just too often probation folks don't know know about victim compensation. So I would encourage you to just Google your state and victim compensation and be able to give victims a referral, because it can help them pay for a lot of the financial challenges that arise from being a victim of crime. The one that you're going to deal with probably a lot as community corrections professionals is reasonable protection and victim safety and security. And all I can tell you is that if a victim does not feel safe, she or he is not going to participate in justice processes. They're not going to want to even talk to you. And a big thing that victim advocates can do, and we have a referral on the bottom, is to work specifically with your survivors on safety planning. And you don't have to specifically know how to do a safety plan with victims, but you need to be able to get to someone who can help them with that. We've got great resources at APPA specific to that. The other thing that is probably co-important is the victim has the right to a victim impact statement, and their input into the pre-sentence investigation, it can be super helpful to you, because I think you all know sometimes the probationer's version of what happened in the criminal case does not always match that of the victim, and it's so important to ask the victim what happened and to learn about the impact as a result of the crime on them and their family and their lives. I probably don't have to talk a lot about restitution, because in community corrections this always seems to bubble to the top. I will just say that we tend to sometimes drop the ball on restitution, and sometimes we focus too much on a probationer's ability to pay, when I think we need to also focus on the fact that most victims can't afford to pay the pecuniary losses that result from crime. And there's a lot of work being done on restitution now that I think will be extremely helpful as we move into the future. And the last thing, and I put a toll-free number at the bottom, is to be able to refer victims to supportive services. And the toll-free number on the bottom is run by the National Center for Victims of Crime, where a victim can call. They can also access it by their website and get referrals for supportive services in the community. And I am proud to say we do have a lot of really good tribal victim services that hopefully y'all are aware of. And on the left side, if you want to learn more about victims' rights, NCVLI is our go-to agency in Oregon that does that. I'm going to sort of breeze through some communications communication skills with victims, but really focus on some of the examples, because I want to walk you through kind of how I advise community corrections folks to improve their communications with victims. Active listening, and y'all have probably had lots of experience and lots of training on this, but with victims, it's listening to what the person is saying without kind of thinking ahead to our next question, without thinking about the information we need to get, without saying anything that will make the survivor feel like he or she is being judged or blamed. And we want to listen to what they're saying, the content of the message, but very often victims will try to express feelings. And again, my experience working with a lot of tribal survivors is they'll try to express that they're afraid without telling you that they're afraid. It's really important to be able to listen to things that they're saying and try to assess that. And simply trying to stand in their shoes to understand to the degree possible and relate to the situation that they're going through and the feelings that they're having. And this can be very, very difficult when you're doing a lot of your work on the phone. How do you do this with survivors? You pay attention. You try to listen to the full story without interrupting the victim. And again, if you have time constraints, this can be a real challenge. With a lot of victims, and my experience again working in tribal communities, we have to be comfortable with silence. We have to be very comfortable also in asking victims to clarify something that they might have said that we don't understand. And as I've sort of said throughout this whole webinar, our reactions and our feelings aren't as important as what the victim is going through. And that's really, really, I think that's important to recognize. And my last point here is to really appreciate the value of the victim's input. And in a lot of the casework that we do, it is really the value as a witness to the case. But yeah, whenever I talk to a victim, I just let them know that I'm grateful for their input and how it's going to be helpful to, in your case, it would be to the case and to the decisions that are going to be made about how you supervise the probationer in the community, and that you couldn't really do a good case plan without the victim input. We call that validating a victim, and I have to tell you, it's my most important skill as a victim advocate. Just an example I want to share is, a victim saying, I know I said I was afraid of him and I wanted a protective order, but I didn't really mean it. An active listening, for me, it would be saying to the victim that what I hear you saying is that you have concerns about your safety, and that your initial concerns led you to file for a protective order, and let's talk about those concerns that you had in the beginning. So just taking that one little hint from the victim and turning it back to why they wanted a protective order in the first place. The second one is actually ripped from the headlines, a real case. Our kids need a dad. I need him to keep working to support us. He's never hurt the kids that I know of. He's a really good provider when he doesn't get liquored up and angry at me. And in a communication like this with victims, it is validating that the person that you're going to be supervising might be a really good dad, but also what the victim is telling you is that they have financial concerns, which again, a referral to victim compensation might be very helpful. That obviously the person that you're supervising may have problems with alcohol or other drugs, and obviously with this victim, they seem to think that the drinking causes the violence, which is not true. And so taking a sentence like this and sort of putting it into bite sizes is a big part of what active listening is all about. Paraphrasing, I do a lot of this with victims. It's basically, you say back to the victim in your own words what you understood that person to be saying. And what this does is it really kind of validates to the victim that you're getting them and you're getting their communications. And the other thing it does, and for me it's really important, when I paraphrase back to victims, very often they'll say to me, oh, that's not what I meant at all. And it really gives me a chance and an opportunity to clarify what that person meant. How do you paraphrase? It's focusing on keywords and concepts and using your own words without changing the meaning of what the victim said. And I'm going to give you an example. A lot of people don't consider burglary a big deal, but it was to my family. My kids are now jittery and scared, and we had to buy an alarm system, which is a big cost to us. And I know it's no big deal to you, but it is to us. Paraphrasing in this is that saying to the victim that what happened to your family was really, really awful, and it sounds like everyone now has concerns about their safety, which is not unusual at all. And I want you to know that this case and what happened to you is a big deal to me, and it is a big deal to the criminal justice system. And I want to work with you on helping you develop a safety plan, and I want to do everything I can do to help you and your kids feel a little bit safer if that's possible. And again, it's taking everything and breaking it down into little chunks where you can respond back and paraphrase to the victim. Reflecting is trying to understand what the victim is saying and what they're feeling, even though that they may not have expressed those feelings. And as I said earlier, a victim who is traumatized is going to have very often a lot of difficulty in communicating, and a lot of times difficulty in expressing those feelings. So you have to really sort of listen between the sentences as well. I always try to take mental notes, or if I take a lot of written notes of key points that the victim is saying, and think about how I am feeling in response to that, and asking myself how I would feel if I was going through that same experience. I have learned working in tribal communities is to also listen for what is not being said. And very often what victims say to me really ends up being that they're afraid, that they don't understand what is going on with the system. And the third one, and really important, is that they have concerns about their finances, that they don't have enough funds to really sustain their life, especially if probationer was the person who's the breadwinner in the family. They may not say that to you out loud, but it's something that you have to listen to in terms of reflective listening. Affirmation is, without being patronizing, and that's really hard to do. I'm so glad you talked to me, and you're so brave for taking time to complete the pre-sentence investigation. We don't want to be patronizing in our words, but we want to validate the victim's strength, and we want to validate that their role in the justice processes that's so much more than just being a witness, that there's someone who was harmed by crime. Why is that important? It really helps to build the victim's confidence, but it also, for me personally, it builds their capacity to trust me and to trust that the criminal justice system and that probation is going to be attentive to their needs. And that is really important in terms of their wanting to participate. And an example is simply, at first I was really scared when I received your message about this thing called probation, but I think I made the right decision in calling you back. Affirming a victim who says something like this is to say, I am just really glad that you decided to call me back, and I'm going to work with you to make sure that you realize that that was a good choice, because I am here to help you, and I'm going to do my best to also link you up with victim services that can provide you with further support. And again, recognizing with victims that they may have safety concerns, and anytime we can address that, anytime a victim says I was scared, being able to recognize that is a concern about their personal safety. Y'all know the differences between open-end and closed-ended questions, and I will tell you, a lot of survivors, they like the closed-ended questions. If they can say yes, no, and get it over with, that for them is a good thing. For you, it's not as helpful as open-ended questions. And I think it's important with victims, I try to mix and match, where I will ask an open-ended question and then a couple of closed-ended questions, so that they can, think a little bit deeply on the open-ended questions and be able to take a break by answering a simple yes or no question. But you're going to get better information by open-ended questions. I can sum it up by saying you want to ask yourself what information you need to get before you ask a question. And, with the limited time you have with victims, you have to be pretty precise. Are you trying to do a PSI? Are you trying to document financial losses for restitution? And the other thing, you have to be thinking about every word that you say. How can that help the victim? And not just in referrals, but as I said earlier, in the way that we communicate with victims, being able to be calming and assuring. And the other thing is to ask questions one at a time, so that it isn't confusing, and being able to clarify, because victims may get confused. I learned, it was almost 30 years ago, and I came up with these suggestions from my work with probation officers. And they basically said, we don't have time. We just don't have enough time to talk to victims, because a conversation with victims sometimes can be rather lengthy. And so just some time tips that I hope, Mike, could be helpful to you, is to be prepared in advance, to be very specific about what you need going into the telephone call, going into the meeting. I always tell people, try to find a scheduled block of time, and I do this myself, to talk to victims or to return their calls. And I don't make it at the end of the day when I'm tired and cranky. I try to do it before lunch. I try to do it when I still have energy and really am able to focus on those calls. Think about the information you need to give and receive, write it down. And again, the best tip I can give you is to always have a good list of referrals. And I've got my email at the end. I'm happy to work with any of you in your own jurisdictions, because I do know a lot of victim advocates in pretty much all around the country. That becomes really important, to be able to refer victims. for me with victims, I always say it's going to help both of us if we can identify and focus on your major concerns. Right up front, that sort of sets the tone for the conversation, that we're being attentive to them. But if a victim has, financial concerns, or they're in a homeless shelter, and they are just having all kinds of issues, you want to know that right up front. You want to say, always be thank you for calling. Let's see if we can identify the ways I can assist you. And the other thing is to let victims know that I'd like to help you, but I always let victims know sometimes I am not the best person. They may have needs that are greater than your capacity to meet them, and it's okay to let them know that you may have to make a referral. A lot of people have disagreed with me on this, but I know everyone's time is limited, and if I'm talking to a survivor and I have 10 minutes, I say up front, I only have 10 minutes, and I wish I had more time, but let's see what we can do to meet your needs and meet my needs in this time frame. And I've heard from a lot of victims who said that was really helpful to know that, and to be able for them to be able to say, well, I only have 10 or 15 minutes, and it helps them, I think, to focus, and it helps them to organize their thinking. We need to let victims know, unless you are a counselor, that you're not a counselor, but that we can make referrals if they need more help. And I have to tell you, I am not a mental health professional, and I end up saying this a lot to survivors. I can help them with practical things, but ethically, I cannot be a counselor. And the other thing is letting victims know, what is your job as a probation officer? Be very clear about that. And it sounds like they might need to talk to someone else that has experience to address their needs, and to be able to provide them with a referral. Ending a conversation, it's trying to find a break in the victim's call with you, or the victim's chat with you if it's in person. And for me, it's just, my mama taught me to be polite. It's just being very appreciative for their call, for their conversation, that I'm glad you called. To tell victims that the information that you've given me is very helpful is the most validating thing you can say to a victim. And the other thing is recognizing that these are busy people too, and that we're grateful that they took time to share their concerns, to talk to you, to give input into the case. And again, being able to say, I wish I had more time, and since I don't, is there any final information I should have? I think it's really important that if we can offer victims action steps, that's really helpful. And action steps for often with y'all folks is to be able to document their financial losses for restitution, to be able to talk to a victim advocate who can help them with the safety plan, to be able to register for victim notification services, to be able to fill out a compensation claim. So to be able to give them practical steps, then that actually, it helps you, but it also helps the victim in terms of getting them to think about the most important things that they need to do. And finally, just be very grateful and thanking the victim for calling, for talking to you. And I talk to a lot of probation folks, and actually a lot of victim advocates, who get very frustrated because victims can sometimes be angry. And you need to understand that anger is a manifestation of not only victim trauma, but very often the way that trauma is treated or negated by not just the justice system, but also by people who should be in a position to help the victim. So it's important that we focus not just on the fact that the victim is angry, but what might be causing the anger. And I always tell people to not take it personally, because it isn't. And this is easier said than done. And I've got 35 years of practice in this, and it still is sometimes really challenging to not take it personally. I've just learned to say that I can tell that you're really upset. And the most important thing I do after saying that is I say, let's see if we, not me, but if we can identify and address the things that are making you so upset. And again, hopefully you've learned over this hour, a lot of what I do is just break things down into manageable things for victims, that they have safety concerns, that they're broke, that they have no transportation to get to the courthouse. It's usually something that we can address. And I always tell folks, your job description does not require verbal or emotional abuse. And if someone is being really mean to you and really rude to you, you do not have to take that. And very often it's helpful to seek help from a supervisor if someone is really inappropriately, their anger is turning into something that's very disdainful for you. And I want to leave time for questions, but I always tell probation folks, you may be the first person the victim has spoken to. And a lot of people say, well, why? They've gone through investigation, they've gone through the criminal justice system. I always tell folks, never assume that they've accessed victim services. Never assume that someone has contacted them from the court prior to you. You just don't know that. So you might be the first person, and you may end up being the most important person that victim needs to talk to. And I can't emphasize that enough, and that's why my love for community corrections and my respect for y'all's work is so broad, because when a perpetrator is in the community, victims have a lot more concerns than they would have if the person was incarcerated. So your work is really important, and your capacity to not only be able to, to work with victims, but to be able to help them with referrals to victim services becomes just super important in the work that you do. So I want to say that's my email before we get to questions. I want to thank you for your most important work and recognizing that everything that you do every day just has a really profound effect, not only on individuals, victims, and survivors, but on community service. So I am your fangirl of all fangirls and appreciate the good work that you do. And I'm going to turn it back to my colleague, Travis, to see if we have any questions or thoughts.
Hey, Ann, thank you for that great presentation. I haven't got any questions yet. You guys feel free to type those in the chat or the question section on the GoToWebinar on the side of the screen. Until then, we've been joined by Mr. Julius Dupree, policy advisor from BJA, and he wants to say some words about some potential funding opportunities. So.
Oh, hey, Julius. I'm so glad you're here.
Hello? Yes. Hi. Thank you. Can you hear me, Travis?
Yes, sir. I hear you.
Thank you, sir. So yeah, thank you for. I just wanted to raise. There are a couple of funding opportunities that do seem pertinent to community supervision work, especially. And so I wanted to make sure that you all may be familiar with them, but I just wanted to at least highlight them and bring them to your attention. So we have a couple of we have one that's a grant opportunity. That's the Comprehensive Opioid Abuse Site-Based Program, and that's it's also called CARA. That ends June 7th, 2018. So if you're going to apply for that, you may want to look at kind of get an idea of where that is located. It's actually the BJA website, but you can also go to the Tribal Justice and Safety website and then click on our funding link and find that. We also have a adult drug court discretionary grant program solicitation. It closes June 5th. And then we have another one. We have improving reentry for adults with co-occurring substance abuse and mental illness. That closes June 18th. And then there's the adult reentry and employment strategic planning program. Applications are due June 18th, 2018. And for more information, you can just go to the www.usdoj.gov/tribal website, and then there you'll see the link for all the funding, BJ funding opportunities there. So that's it. Thank you, though.
All right, thank you, Julius. I guess we don't have any questions. I haven't had any so far, so I'd like to thank everyone for being here and thank our presenter, Ann Seymour. And we'd like to take this time to extend an invitation to our next webinar, which will be next month. It'll be June 27th, Sex Offenders and Reentry, presented by Michelle Parks, Assistant Director of Tribal Judicial Institute at UND. And we'll shortly send the information and registration out for that link. And I'd like to thank everybody.
Thank you, Travis. Thank you, Julius.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, guys. I'll see you at the next one.